I think many people believe pageants to be a modern invention born out of a time of bizarre pastimes in the early 20th century. But in actuality, its roots go way deeper than most people realize. From religious rituals to gods of antiquity and grueling courtship dances to circus sideshows and seasonal festivals, this journey includes many familiar figures you may have not associated with pageants until now.
Hey y'all, my name is Shelby, pronouns they, she, and I am the pageant archivist.
Before we get into today's topic, the origins of beauty pageants, I'd like to go over just a bit of terminology. Yes, the person with the English degree wants to talk about words, but it'll be quick. The word pageant hasn't always been used to describe the stage competitions we see today. Pageants of the past didn't really involve competition. Participants would reenact historical events and tales from myth or folklore. They wore elaborate costumes to portray the characters and figures from these stories. They walked in parades. There was a lot of, pageantry. It was more along the lines of what we would see today, like your joust at the Renaissance Festival, Civil War battle reenactments, or your church nativity play. These pageants of the past would be held alongside events like anniversaries to certain historical events, festivals, parties, or they would be held as their own thing. It wasn't until much, much later that the word pageant and beauty contest would be an interchangeable term. The only ways I see pageants today resembling the pageants of old is the fact that at your local parade, you'll probably see a few beauty queens on the backs of convertibles or pickup trucks, and the fact that pageants today also have elaborate clothing through its evening gowns, the runway looks, and of course the national and state costume competitions. Now, the idea of choosing a fairest of them all via competition is an ancient concept, almost universal. Such competitions go way back. Greek mythology contains one of the earliest known contests, known as the Judgment of Paris. The story goes that Zeus, king of the gods, is in the process of planning a wedding and is putting together the guest list. When assembling the guest list, Zeus decides to omit one particular person, Eris, the goddess of chaos and strife. It makes sense, right? You don't want a chaos goddess at your wedding. They're already stressful enough as it is. But you know what else makes sense? Eris being upset that she was omitted from the guest list. No one likes being left out, especially if you're being left out of an event that is being put on by your own father. As an act of revenge, Eris arrives at the banquet and throws a golden apple into the party. Doesn't seem like a big deal, except the fact that the apple has written on it, Kallistae, or in English, to the most beautiful woman or to the fairest one. If you know anything about the Greek pantheon, I think I was trying to combine Pantheon with Parthenon. If you know anything about the Greek pantheon, you know that all of them are a bunch of egomaniacs. 3 goddesses stepped forward to claim the apple. Contestant number 1, Hera, queen of the gods and the goddess of marriage, women, and childbirth. Contestant number 2, Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy. And contestant number 3, Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. Conflict ensues, because it always does, and they ask Zeus to resolve the matter for them. Zeus is not a man who enjoys reaping the consequences of his own actions, so he outsources the problem. Now, I will do something here that I never thought I would do, which is cut Zeus some slack. The question he's being asked here is, who's the most beautiful? Your wife, your daughter, or your daughter? That's not a question anybody can really answer in that position. He could always say, oh, all of them are equally beautiful and split the apple in 3, but the joint custody sort of arrangement wasn't really an option at that point. When Zeus is trying to decide who will judge the contest, he thinks back to another competition in which he had a mortal judge the beauty of 2 bulls. One of the bulls belonged to said mortal, while the other belonged to Ares, the god of war. The mortal had a lot to gain from winning this contest, but he instead decided to be impartial and, without hesitation, said that Ares' bull was the best. This was the kind of good character Zeus was looking for. Thus, the judge was chosen, Prince Paris of Troy. Everyone involved gathered on Mount Ida, where Zeus consulted with Paris on the criteria of the competition, whilst the goddesses bathed in a local spring and prepped themselves to be presented before their judge. As things got started, you'd think that the competition would automatically go to Aphrodite, given the fact that she's the goddess of beauty, right? Well, Hera was actually considered to be the more physically beautiful one, and Aphrodite in turn was considered to be more charming and have a lot more sex appeal. As Paris continued to assess the 3 goddesses, they all started to offer him bribes, which in a modern pageant would get you disqualified and banned, but this is antiquity. Hera offered to crown Paris the king of Europe and Asia. Athena offered him wisdom in all of his future battles. And Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world. All tempting offers, but Paris chose Aphrodite in the prize she was offering. She won the golden apple, and Paris earned her favor, while also earning the absolute ire of Hera and Athena. The most beautiful woman in the world at the time was Queen Helen of Sparta. Just one problem. She was married. Paris had to do the work of traveling to Sparta, pretending it was a diplomatic mission so that he could retrieve Helen. The retellings go either way in terms of whether or not Helen went with Paris willingly or if this was just flat out kidnapping. Either way, Queen Helen of Sparta became Helen of Troy, and King Menelaus did everything he possibly could to get her back, which meant invading Troy and engaging in the bloodiest war in all of Greek mythology, the Trojan War. You know, it's kind of ironic that the stereotypical pageant answer is like, world peace, and yet this pageant caused a war that destroyed an entire civilization. How times have changed. Although this story is just that, a story, we do get the modern word for beauty pageant from this story via kalistia. The tradition of ranking beauty would continue in myth and folklore, but if we want to find an actual historical event, we're drawn in 2 separate directions. And for the first one, we're going to stay in ancient Greece. There are 3 competitions that all have elements of what we would see in a modern beauty pageant. And unlike the myth we just discussed, they were all for men. They were the Kalisteria, the Euandria, and the Euexia. Kalisteria were beauty competitions held within different cults that worshipped the many gods and goddesses of the ancient Greek pantheon. I know that modern connotations of a cult are rather negative, but this was more along the lines of choosing one particular god or goddess to worship and not like the Heaven's Gate IBLP crap. They held Kalisteria beauty contests as a way to choose who would hold honored places in certain rituals. The winners' prizes varied from contest to contest. In one cult dedicated to Athena, the winner was crowned in a circlet made of myrtles, decorated in ribbons, given weapons as a prize, and led the procession to the temple. These competitions were taken very seriously, especially given the fact that they were considered part of worship and not just something for personal glory. The second competition during this time period was the Euandria, or Contest of Physique. The most famous Euandria was held in the 470s BCE in Athens and associated with a festival called Theseia. In this festival honoring the mythic hero Theseus, the male contestants would partake in athletic challenges as teams from different tribes in Athens in order to show valuable character traits, military prowess, and athletic ability. This competition was much more physical in comparison to the Kalisteria, and to a modern viewer, it sounds much more like an athletic competition as opposed to a pageant. However, the Euandria was described as a beauty competition during its time period, and my guess to that is because for contemporary male beauty standards in ancient Greece, yeah, it was great that you had muscles, but you had to be able to use them for something practical. Thus, the Euandria provided that. Prizes again varied from contest to contest, but the winners in the particular Athenian event would receive an ox as well as special shields for their prize. The final competition in this time period was the Euexia. Unlike the Euandria, this contest was of individuals and not teams. This was also an athletic event, and the primary way for a man participating in this challenge was through gymnastics, since many of these contests were held as a way to honor the god Hermes, whose many domains of rule included gymnastics. The physique standards were also a bit different from the Euandria. Competitors focused more on the symmetry and muscle definition of their bodies rather than how large their muscles could get. Any modern bodybuilder, fitness competitor can tell you just how difficult it is to maintain that sort of form. It's not only a very rigorous exercise routine, but also a very strict diet. Euexia contests were also held more often than the Euandria, so there was a lot more pressure for the men participating to maintain their skills and figures. Now that we've gotten ancient Greece taken care of, we are going to head to West Africa. Like the ancient Greek competitions, this is also a contest just for men. The Wadabe are a nomadic tribe of traders and cattle herders who observe a mix of both ancient traditions within their culture as well as Islam, which was introduced into the community in the 16th century. Their migrations take them between Chad, Niger, and Nigeria, as well as further south to Cameroon, Central African Republic, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The specific migration that is relevant to our story here takes place every September once the rainy season is complete.
Clans within the Wadabe will gather for a festival where the young men will participate in an event called the Gerwal.
Men present themselves in their best attire, which includes colorful face paint, beautiful patterned clothes, and lots of jewelry and adornments. If you've ever seen videos or pictures from the event, you'll notice the competitors smiling very widely and rolling their eyes back. The purpose of this is to show off how white their teeth and eyes are, because this is a major beauty standard for their culture. However, like pageants of today, it's not just about how attractive you are. The men in the competition must perform the yake, which is a dance that also includes percussive singing. This is not your typical 90-second to 2.5-minute talent you see here at a pageant in the US. They have to perform this multiple times for hours each time in the hot, dry sun. This is meant to not only show their beauty, but also their endurance and passion to the judges. And I can assure you that the men are very interested in proving themselves to these judges, because the judges are available women. This whole competition is a courtship. The men either want to marry or marry again, since polygamy is the norm amongst the Wadabe, or they want to have a temporary arrangement with someone who catches their eye. This is also a time in which a woman can leave her current husband and find a new one amongst the dancers. The way the judging works is, after careful observation, the woman choosing the man she wants will make a very subtle hand gesture pointing to him. There isn't any fanfare about it. She doesn't even make eye contact with him. If you blink, you might miss it. She's rolling sleight of hand at an advantage, and you're rolling perception at a disadvantage. This is because the Wodabe have very high standards of modesty and temperance. For example, a man and woman married to each other are not allowed to hold hands during the daytime. So the subtlety of the actual choosing makes sense from that perspective.
The Jewel has gone on for centuries.
It's not clear when it began, since there are no written records, given the Wodabe utilize oral tradition only. This is why I decided to highlight both the ancient Greek competitions as well as the Wodabe competition. I don't want to discount one culture just because they don't utilize written tradition, because we don't necessarily know how far back it goes. Even if we were able to confirm that the Greek competitions went on earlier, we do know that the Wodabe hold the longest running beauty contest, as this still goes on to this day. And they are welcoming to outsiders, travelers, visitors who would like to see this dance in person. Beauty contests and pageants would continue to evolve through the centuries. During the medieval period, European festivals and jousts would include the crowning of a Queen of Beauty. Choosing a May Queen during the May Day festivals in England would be an example. The queens would be crowned and paraded about as symbols of the community's ideal woman. She was beautiful and of good moral standing, usually women of noble birth. While there aren't a lot of records of who exactly was crowned during these events, we do have a record of a reenactment. This took place in 1839. Archibald Montgomery, 13th Earl of Eglinton, organized this event, and the title of Queen of Beauty went to Georgiana Seymour, Duchess of Somerset. As time went on, the queens of these festivals would have more duties to attend to, particularly in festivals here in the United States, as Europeans brought their traditions over across the Atlantic. We can see remnants of these traditions in modern-day festival pageants. I remember when I was a pickle princess for the Mount Olive Pickle Festival, I had certain obligations to attend to, like putting on a performance, as well as being out and about supporting the vendors and interacting with the folks who also attended the fair. However, the world had yet to see a modern beauty pageant as we know it today. No one had really thought to hold a staged competition in which judges assessed a group of women to determine who was the best. It's kind of a wacky idea when you think about it. Luckily for the Victorians, they'd had one individual who was quite good at putting on wacky performances. Phineas Taylor Barnum. But you probably know him as P.T. Barnum. Now, we're not talking The Greatest Showman here, given that both old and contemporary accounts of Barnum that portray him in a very glamorized way are not particularly accurate. He's not a good dude. Just a few of his wrongdoings include owning enslaved people, exploiting and stealing the wages from his performers, animal cruelty, and swindling people out of their money with fake displays. However, P.T. Barnum was the first pageant director in history, so we gotta talk about him. In 1854, Barnum attempted to put on the first modern beauty pageant. He had put on similar contests before to judge the beauty of flowers, dogs, birds, and even babies. Yes, P.T. Barnum was the first child beauty pageant director. However, when he tried to do this for adult women, the results didn't quite turn out the way he had hoped. You'll notice I said attempted earlier. And despite him offering the prize of a dowry if the winner was single, or a nice tiara if it was a married woman who won, the people of the Victorian era were not pleased. The upcoming contest was met with absolute outrage and ire, and it even sparked protests. If you think about it from a historical context, it makes sense. Participating in a pageant could mean a damaged reputation, and a damaged reputation for a woman in that time period meant decreased financial security, and this was not a time in which women had a great deal of economic prospects. However, in a brilliant stroke of compromise, Barnum decided to run his beauty contest not as a staged event, but through a photo contest using daguerreotypes. Daguerreotype was the first form of photography available to the public and was widely used during the 1840s and 50s. And pageant folks, if that sounds familiar, you would be correct. This was the ancestor to the modern photo contests that you see in pageants today. Today's photo contests are held either prior to the pageant as a way to win fees off, or it's held during the pageant as an optional event that doesn't count towards winning the actual crown, but you can win a prize for being the winner. There are photo contests today that run as actual pageants, but they just aren't as common. Despite Barnum not getting the competition he initially wanted, this sort of event took off in popularity. Newspapers around the country started holding their own photogenic beauty contests within their pages. It took several more decades until a version of a modern pageant would come to a physical stage. In 1880, the first ever bathing beauty contest was held in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, as a way to promote the summer festival. It's rumored that Thomas Edison was a judge during this contest, but I really couldn't find anything to confirm that. Which is also probably for the best, because like P.T. Barnum, Edison was not a good dude. The ones who did judge the contest crowned Miss Myrtle Merriweather as their winner and Miss United States. Although this first pageant wouldn't have a second edition, the world would see another one of these bathing beauty competitions 8 years later in Spa, Belgium. In order to be considered for this competition, the potential candidates had to send in a photo as well as a personal description. And that's pretty similar to the way you might enter a modern beauty pageant today, with a resume as well as a headshot. In the end, 21 ladies made it to the competition. I couldn't find a record of the name of the winner of this particular competition, only that she was an 18-year-old Creole woman. Now at this point, it's been over 30 years since Barnum initially tried to put on his attempt at a beauty pageant, and you'd think since it actually went through that people would be cool with it now, right? No, they weren't. While there wasn't the same level of vitriol as the 1850s, the 1880s was also not welcoming to a beauty contest. It was still considered to be a trashy event, and no upper class or respectable woman would ever consider degrading herself by walking across a pageant stage. However, this attitude didn't stop organizers from putting on these competitions as a way to bring in business for local spots as well as promote local festivals. In 1920, C.E. Bartfield organized an event called Splash Day in Galveston, Texas, that kicked off the summer season. Galveston really needed this tourist attraction as the community was still recovering from the hurricane of 1900 that ravaged the island. If you're interested in learning about that particular catastrophe, I'd recommend the book Isaac Storm. Amongst the many summertime activities, Splash Day included a bathing girl revue that served as the centerpiece of the event. Contestants didn't have to do much prior to the event. They didn't have to be particularly graceful on stage. All they had to do was show up in a swimsuit, and the judges would choose the contestant who they thought was the prettiest. The revue became an annual tradition, and it became popular enough that in 1926, it became known as the International Pageant of Pulchritude, the very first international beauty pageant. The contest would evolve and undergo a bit of a name change that we would be familiar with today. The pageant would split and start awarding two different titles. First, they would crown a Miss United States, and then the next day they would crown a Miss Universe. The Miss United States pageant would have competitors from areas all around the country, from New York to Louisiana to Utah, and of course Texas. Meanwhile, the Miss Universe contest attracted a multitude of international representatives, including Turkey, Philippines, England, and Brazil, to name a few. We're gonna get to Brazil in a minute because there's some drama there. The way it would work is the Miss United States would be crowned, and then the next day, the new Miss United States would compete along with the other international competitors for the Miss Universe title. The first person to win Miss United States was future television and film actress Catherine Moylan of Dallas, Texas. The next day, she would become the first Miss Universe. Popularity for the contest grew a lot more overseas than it did on American soil, ironically enough, and it became especially popular in Brazil. The 1929 contest drew in a lot of attention, and crowds gathered around major newspaper offices in order to hear whether or not the Brazilian delegate would bring home the crown. She didn't even place, and the crowds were furious. They were so furious, in fact, that they decided to hold their very own Miss Universe in 1930. Of course, the Brazilian delegate won, and the delegate from the United States did not place. That move would not fly in modern pageantry, especially considering the fact that all major titles are copyrighted, although the pettiness is pretty par for the course in the pageant world. Despite all of this, the original Miss Universe in Texas would still be held. The Miss United States won for the 4th time, making 1930 the only year where there were 2 Miss Universes reigning at the same time. Despite the juicy drama, this pageant was on its last leg. It was the Great Depression. 1931 would be the last year it would be held in Galveston. In 1932, it would be held in Spa, Belgium, and the location change didn't help. The competition would go on a brief hiatus until 1935, where it would be held in Brussels, but that would be that competition's last year of operation. Pageants tend to be casualties during economic downturns. I remember during the 2008 recession that a lot of well-established pageant systems went under. When it comes to tightening budgets and hard times, hobbies like pageants, especially expensive hobbies, tend to be the first ones cut out of the budget. We wouldn't see another international pageant until the establishment of Miss World in 1951, and we wouldn't see another Miss Universe until 1952. This Miss Universe was under a completely different organization, and it started because of a certain Miss America, and we can't talk about the history of pageants until we talk about Miss America. In 1921, the following year after the start of the International Pageant of Pulchritude, the first Miss America pageant would be held in Atlantic City, New Jersey, as a way to increase tourism in the area. A beauty pageant held on February 1st, 1919, in the Hôtel des Artistes in New York City crowned Edith Norman Hyde as Miss America. The pageant drew in several hundred young women who dressed for the concurrent event, which was the Oriental-themed Chu Chin Chow Ball. The individuals who put on this event were not in any way associated with the Miss America organization as we know it today. Instead, the organization's roots go back to September 25th, 1920, where in Atlantic City, the Fall Frolic was in full swing. The purpose of this particular set of festivities was to draw in crowds for one last hurrah so businesses could make a little bit more money before the colder months set in. That particular year included a parade of young, beautiful women led by Ernestine Cremona, who was dressed in all white and symbolized peace. The parade was a hit, so the Businessmen's League decided to turn this into an annual Bathing Beauties competition, and they would call it the Intercity Beauty Contest. Newspapers advertised for the event around the country with the promise that the newspapers would pay for the contestants' wardrobe, while the league would pay for the contestants' travel. In the end, 100,000 people gathered in Atlantic City, New Jersey to watch 9 contestants grace the very first Miss America stage. In the end, 16-year-old Margaret Gorman, Miss Washington, D.C., would win the title, the most beautiful bathing girl in America, along with the Intercity Beauty Amateur Award. Journalist Herb Tess would later call the pageant's winner Miss America, and the name just kind of stuck. Despite the fact that crowns and pageants go together like peanut butter and jelly, Margaret Gorman wouldn't receive her crown until she returned to Atlantic City next year. The pageant became a staple in Atlantic City for Labor Day and was held consistently until the Great Depression. The pageant had to go on a brief hiatus for financial reasons. Sound familiar? Unlike the earlier Miss Universe pageant held in Galveston, Miss America would be able to make a comeback in 1933 after its hiatus, but it had to make several changes. At the time, Miss America suffered from a bit of a reputation crisis due to a lot of detractors saying that the pageant promoted loose morals. They needed an image rehabilitation, the first of many throughout its history. However, not all pageants suffered from this same reputation issue. If you've seen photos from these early pageants, you've probably noticed the pool of candidates is very white, which was very much on purpose. Not only were these contests heavily segregated, but European beauty standards were the only standards celebrated. However, this didn't mean you wouldn't find non-white beauty queens during this time period. Pageants existed in the Black community since the early 20th century.
Prior to staged events, beauty contests via photographs, like the daguerreotype contest started by Barnum, took place in the late 19th century.
While Black women were dehumanized by racist stereotypes and aggressions from individuals, hate groups, government bodies, and policies like Jim Crow, pageants were used as a tool to combat that hatred, celebrate Black women's beauty, and recognize their accomplishments. The prevailing tropes of Black women during this time period cast them as inherently morally loose. However, pageants in the Black community presented an image of Black women as beautiful and inherently worthy of respect, dignity, and veneration. Combating racism in segregated America was not the only way Black pageants were progressive during its time period. While the bathing beauty revues held in exclusively white spaces were explicitly using the youthful beauty and sex appeal of its contestants to draw in consumers for local businesses and events, the pageants in the Black community held an atmosphere that mirrored more of a cultural exhibition. One example is a contest held in tandem with the Autumn Exhibition and Amusement Festival at the Manhattan Casino in New York in 1914. The event opened with the beauty contest that showcased 15 finalists out of 200 entrants and saw Hazel Macbeth crowned as its queen. Festival goers would then go on to view booths and displays of accomplishments achieved by people of color in fields like visual arts, dancing, and athletics. Many contest organizers also shook up the beauty standards of the time by highlighting and celebrating Afrocentric features. This rebuked the prevailing ideas of eugenics and European beauty standards that marginalized so many people of color during this time period. This isn't to say that there weren't any sort of issues with internalized racism, colorism, stuff like that within these contests. There definitely were, and that's a whole other story that could be its own video, but it did offer the opportunity for African American women to partake in these contests, knowing that multiple forms of beauty would be celebrated. It wasn't just the more accepting environment that drew women in to compete. The contest also provided a lot of prizes beyond just the trophies and the crowns. Cash prizes for a lot of the contestants meant the ability to financially support their families in the midst of limited opportunities and dramatic pay discrepancies due to discrimination that would only be compounded by the oncoming Great Depression. And there was a lot of money to be won. For example, the 1939 Queen of Bronzeville competition offered a $100 prize, which in today's money would be more along the lines of $2,300. And unlike the Miss America pageant, these opportunities would remain open during the Great Depression and would continue to be well funded. I want to stay with the Queen of Bronzeville pageant for a second because I'm sure many of y'all remember in 2018 when Miss America announced that it would be eliminating the swimsuit competition, and that being a huge deal, especially in the midst of third wave feminism and the hashtag #MeToo movement. However, pageants for Black women beat them by about 70 years. The contest to select the mayor and Queen of Bronzeville was held in 1939 as a way to celebrate the East Chicago and Gary, Indiana communities. When scouting for potential candidates, the flyers and advertisements emphasized the fact that the newly crowned queen would not have to compete in a bathing suit competition. It would not be asked to pose in one during her reign. Harmful stereotypes about Black women's sexuality, a problem which still very much persists to this day, caused both the threat and carrying out of harassment and assault to be a daily part of life. Eliminating the requirement of modeling in a swimsuit or posing in one provided a level of comfortability for the candidates. I think the history of pageants in the Black community deserves its own full-length video. And if you're curious about that topic in the meantime, I would recommend the book Black Beauties, African American Pageant Queens in the Segregated South by Dr. Kimberly Brown Pellum, as well as the book Ain't I a Beauty Queen by Maxine Leeds Craig. They're both very fascinating reads and were very helpful in my research for this particular topic. The Queen of Bronzeville, as well as other contests like the Glamour Girl of 1938, more heavily emphasize the intelligence, talents, and accomplishments of their contestants. This shift is also what saved the Miss America pageant. In 1935, the pageant found itself under new management. Enter Lenora Slaughter. This woman has a name that stepped right out of a Tarantino script, but she's a bit more Barbara Bush than Mia Wallace. She was a businesswoman working at the St. Petersburg, Florida Chamber of Commerce, as well as a devout Southern Baptist. Her goal was to create a pageant that attracted women with good reputations and class. When a pageant judge asked her what she was looking for, she replied, "Honey, just pick me a lady." It was Slaughter who created the prize package that Miss America is most well known for, its scholarships. This was very different from the former prize packages, which included things like Hollywood contracts, fur coats, and modeling gigs. Slaughter's goal in this was to set the women up for more economic and career opportunities long after the pageant was over. She didn't want it to just be about physical appearance. This would be shown further as she implemented the talent portion in 1938 and then the interview portion in 1947. It created a greater sense of respectability that offered it a more prominent place in American culture. Other changes included banning title holders who represented commercial businesses, instead opting for those who represented a city or a state. And then eventually it was only state representatives who would compete at Miss America. This is a structure we see today across the US for tons of national pageants. I have yet to see something like a Miss Target or Mrs. Best Buy. Businesses just don't hold pageants anymore, which is a far cry from how it used to be. Some businesses even held pageants for their own female employees for entertainment, not just as a way to whisk her off to a national competition. Slaughter also created more rules regarding the contestants' age, as well as their marital and parental status. The age range for Miss American contestants used to be much wider. Slaughter instead decided to narrow the ranges between 18 and 25. This is a particular rule that contestants would chafe at for years because, one, scholarship needs don't disappear just because you turn 26, unfortunately, nor does the desire to keep competing, because being Miss America or even winning your own state title is a dream that also does not die at 26. Miss America recently raised the age limit up to 28. Thankfully, should have been done sooner. Slaughter would also implement the no marriage, no child rule. Potential title holders could not be married, and they could not have had a marriage end via divorce or annulment. It also ruled that contestants could not have ever been pregnant or given birth to a child or adopted a child. I mean, these rules kind of make sense given Lenora Slaughter's desire for Miss America to be a lady, and during that time period, definition of a lady back then was as restrictive as the bone corsets of the previous Victorian era. However, in retrospect, it would have disqualified several previous Miss Americas. For example, its very first, Margaret Gorman, had eloped with her first husband just prior to winning Miss America. I want to do an entirely separate video about the debate on whether or not married women and women with children should be allowed to compete in contests like Miss America, especially considering the fact that Miss Universe recently allowed married women to compete and women with children to compete, and also completely eliminated its age range, because I have opinions. In order to maintain the ladylike reputation of the contestants, Slaughter put together a team of volunteer chaperones that would escort all of the contestants everywhere they went throughout competition. A curfew was set in place. Contestants weren't allowed to be in less savory places during competitions like bars and nightclubs, and the rule changes worked out very well, and Miss America eventually became an American institution. While Miss America was the most popular pageant to look back on during this time period, it was nowhere near the only one. Once married women were barred from competing in Miss America, contests for married women specifically filled the void. In particular, Mrs. America had its first contest in 1949, although that particular contest isn't associated with the current Miss America pageant run by Mrs. America Incorporated. Similar beauty contests would be held for a variety of competitors. The beauty contests for men would eventually evolve into bodybuilding and fitness competitions. Muscular women would also get their own beauty contests to compete in. There were also competitions for tall women and fat women. Competitions were held for grandmothers as well as little sisters, both at separate events in 1948. Pageants for hairstyles were common in the 1950s. You'd also get your fair share of wackiness via things like an underwater pageant, and a few Miss Atomic Bombs. Let's not forget that pageants would continue to thrive and grow in marginalized communities across the US. You'll find a variety of pageants for specific ethnic and racial groups throughout the 20th century as well as today. And of course, we can't forget about the countless pageants held in the queer community and their importance to its history. All of these pageants have fascinating histories and really deserve their own videos. And I hope to share those with you in the future. If you don't want to miss out on those, be sure to subscribe. The upload schedule is going to be kind of funky as I get the channel up on its legs, so if you could hit the bell, that would be really helpful so you don't miss out on anything. If there are any topics you'd like me to cover, feel free to leave them down in the comments. I'd love to hear about what you're interested in me covering. You can find my sources as well as where to follow me on social media in the description down below. Thank you so much for being here, and I will meet you right here again next time.